Hi, everyone. Okay, so this past summer, in large part thanks to the Center for Civil and Human Rights, I was working in San Francisco at the National Housing Law Project. Let's see, what do I push? This one. So the National Housing Law Project, otherwise known as NHLP, was founded in 1968 and was initially actually a part of Berkeley Law School as a law clinic. They broke off 15 years into their project and are now based in San Francisco. So the basic mission of NHLP is to advance housing rights for low-income individuals in this country. They're very firm believers that housing is a human right. Everyone should have access to safe and affordable housing. Their areas of expertise are federal housing programs, of which there are many, and state and federal fair housing laws. The work they do is primarily policy advocacy, technical legal assistance, and litigation. So policy advocacy they do at both the state and federal level, both in California and in states across the nation. They often help out with policy work for local municipalities, like think in various states. I think one that we worked on this summer was actually in Indiana, but I'd have to double check that. So policy advocacy, for those of you that don't know, I certainly didn't when I started working there, usually involves a lot of letter writing, which sounds maybe not super exciting, but it actually can get a lot of stuff done in terms of influencing agencies to change their policies, in terms of informing local and state governments of their obligations under federal law. So that's an interesting thing. And it actually involves a lot of, I guess, kind of personality work in terms of considering what is NHLP's relationship like with this agency, in terms of the tone of the letter that you write. Technical legal assistance is a huge part of what NHLP does. As I'll get to in a minute, the federal housing law programs in this country are extremely complex and numerous. So a lot of legal aid attorneys helping out clients that are in these federal housing law programs have lots of questions and turn to NHLP. NHLP also does a lot of webinars and trainings on federal housing law programs for both attorneys and other allies for affordable housing. For example, we do a lot of work with a couple of domestic violence shelters in San Francisco in terms of training their employees there on various programs that can benefit their clients. And litigation. NHLP they do not do direct client service work. However, they do get brought in on other litigation that other legal aid attorneys or legal groups are doing. And also, NHLP has sued a couple of federal agencies more than one occasion, most notably rural development. I think there's an attorney in our office who's sued rural development, I think like 12 times throughout his career. Anyways, more on rural development in a minute. So the US is currently in an affordable housing crisis. So this map is a little, obviously it's of the United States, but with federal assistance, there are only 46 units for every 100 extremely low-income families nationwide. So what does this mean? Extremely low-income families, those are families that make 30% or less of the area median income, which is basically the poverty level, but it accounts for local factors, such as it's much more expensive to live in San Francisco than in South Bend. So there are only 46 apartments available for every 100 extremely low-income families across nationwide. And this map here shows that the lighter blue areas are where there are less units, less apartments available for these families, and the darker areas are where there are higher concentrations. This next map is the same map, but it's what the concentration of affordable housing would look like without federal assistance. So without federal assistance nationwide, there would only be 21 units available for every 100 low-income families. And as you can see by the very large swaths of light blue area in much of the country, there would be practically no affordable housing available for these families. What this means for even, in this map with the federal assistance, So, 46 units available. So that means there's, 64 families per 100 families that don't have access to affordable housing. And this can mean a wide variety of things for these families, including being homeless, living on the streets, living in homeless shelters. Another really common thing that we see a lot of is families that have doubled up with other family members or friends. So there'll be 2, 3, 4 families in like a 1-bedroom apartment. And these situations are usually not very stable since it's difficult to live with 8 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. So this causes them to have to move around a lot, which in turn, does not create a very stable situation if you're trying to go to the same school regularly and that kind of thing. So it has a lot of impact beyond just not having somewhere to live. Right, so kind of related to this, kind of a partial explanation of why there's such a large shortage of affordable housing in this country. Obviously, there are a lot of factors. One of them is that we don't spend enough money to provide assistance for these families. And it's not even necessarily just about the dollar amount. So this chart here shows from 2015, the allocation of federal housing expenditures. And the vast majority of them, 70% of federal housing assistance goes to homeowners, which many people might not realize. And actually over 60% of this aid goes to families with incomes of $100,000 or more, which is kind of crazy when you think of all of the millions of families that don't have access to just affordable housing, a safe, stable place to live, period. So I definitely think, and a lot of housing advocates think, that there are ways that we could reallocate some of the money that we're spending on federal housing assistance. Right, so forms of federal housing assistance. There are a lot of them. So on this chart, you can see that one of the largest ones is housing choice vouchers, public housing, section-based Project 8, elderly and disabled housing programs. These are not just like one category of programs. Within each category, there are tons of like individually like specific programs. For example, with housing choice vouchers, there is Vouchers, which are vouchers specifically for veterans, or HOPWA, which is vouchers specifically for people and families suffering from AIDS. So there's a lot in there, but all of these first 4 are within HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Agency. Those are managed by HUD, but this last one here, USDA, there's actually a substantial amount of housing in this country, mostly in rural areas, administered by the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, through their Rural Development Program, which is kind of something I don't think most people think of when they think of, oh yeah, housing programs, USDA, of course. Another common one not on this chart that's really actually gaining a lot of popularity are low-income housing tax credits. And those are actually administered by the IRS, and from the IRS to various state offices. But the IRS is actually in charge of promulgating rules to regulate those programs, although for the most part, they've kind of avoided that duty, but more on that in a second. So my biggest advice to anyone that's interested in going into federal housing law is to take administrative law. Maybe, you'd think, oh, housing, that's property. And while it kind of was touched on in my property class a little bit, it's not really something you cover a lot, but administrative law or legislation and regulation are immensely helpful. The majority of the work that NHLP does is dealing with complex statutes, regulations, and agency guidance letters. And one of the most frequent questions that legal aid attorneys come to NHLP with is just trying to figure out what housing program their client's actually in. Because clients and the public at large will say, oh, I'm in public housing, I have Section 8, when it could mean like, well, you can't really be in public housing because your city doesn't have public housing. So what actually is, the housing program that you're in? And answering this question is really important because the rules for these programs in terms of eligibility and how they interact with other federal statutes and state laws varies. So it can, determine what rights a client has. For example, a lot of the work that I did this summer was with the Violence Against Women Act. It was actually the re-upping of that from 2013, which actually has a lot of housing provisions for people in federally subsidized housing. So the biggest protection offered by VAWA to federal housing tenants is that tenants and applicants can't be discriminated against on the basis that they have been or currently are victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, or stalking. And this applies to everyone. It's not just women. I know women's in the name of the act, but it applies to people of all genders. But anyway, VAWA, for example, has a lot of different rules for different programs. So HUD, for the programs that it administers that was covered by this VAWA rule, created regulations, but rural development under the USDA has not. So what they did was actually they kind of sent out a notice letter saying basically, yeah, whatever HUD said, we're adopting that, which, okay, that's a step forward, but the programs don't exactly line up. And the biggest offender would be the IRS, who should, per the statute, have created rules about VAWA for their low-income housing tax credit programs, but they've kind of abstained from that and are really reluctant to get into that. Right now, the current administration, I'm sure as you've all seen in the news, is really kind of stepping up their enforcement of immigration law. And the way they've done it is really creating a climate of fear and uncertainty in a lot of immigrant communities. There's a huge issue of both immigrants and advocates and affordable housing providers not knowing what the laws are in terms of what they have to report, when do they have to ICE in. There's a lot of confusion. And this is unfortunately creating a lot of bad actors. So there have been tons of reports of unscrupulous landlords holding some tenants' immigration status over their heads. So it's like, well, don't complain about, you know, these terrible conditions in your apartment or I'll report you to ICE. Or you better start paying me $500 extra a month or I'll report you to ICE. Or I'm going to evict you without any reason, but you better not complain because I'll report you to ICE. Unfortunately, at a federal level, there isn't a lot of recourse for these tenants. The Federal Fair Housing Act does not provide protections against discrimination on the basis of nationality. However, there are several states that are working to pass and have passed legislation to provide these protections for tenants. Another one, this is a really sad one, victims of domestic violence. So immigrant victims of domestic violence are coming up to some very hard choices. A lot of the times when their abusers are saying, hey, you can't leave or don't report me because I'll report you to ICE, which is particularly sad since there actually are paths of recourse that these victims can take. For example, the Violence Against Women Act provides a VAWA petitioner status for immigrant victims of domestic violence that are living in federally subsidized housing. So there are ways for them to get help. They just need help learning that they can get help. And then even actors that want to help protect immigrant tenants, for example, public housing authorities and affordable housing providers, are not sure what they can do legally. You know, they don't want to be charged with illegally harboring undocumented immigrants and then have their federal funding removed, which would then hurt all of their other tenants. So there's a lot of confusion on what they have to report. Good news is it's not as much as a lot of them think. You only have to report basically what they are forced to collect, and a lot of the times they don't have to collect the immigration status of all of the rest. It gets very complex, but basically it's not as bad as a lot of them think. Another huge concern is when do affordable housing providers, say like a landlord of a low-income housing tax credit apartment building, when do they have to let ICE in? A lot of people think that, you know, when ICE says, let us in, we have a warrant, that means automatically they have to let ICE in. But what ICE does is actually, they say they have a warrant, but it's actually just an ICE warrant, which doesn't actually give them the legal authority to enter a building without your permission, unlike a judicial warrant. But, you know, a lot of people don't realize this. So when a bunch of guys with guns come pounding on doors and they're like, we've got a warrant, you're like, okay, sorry, tenants can let you in. So it's a really big problem, and it's my hope that I'll actually be able to return to National Housing Law Project after I graduate to help on this issue. I've applied for a lot of fellowships with this immigrant housing rights project proposal. So hopefully that works out. But anyways, I'd really like to thank the Center for Civil and Human Rights for giving me the opportunity to work at the National Housing Law Project and work on these very important issues. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Can you talk, if you know, about, are there state programs, state affordable housing programs that supplement the federal government's programs, or is the map that you showed us the full terrain?
So I can't speak to every state, but at a general level, there aren't a lot of state or local housing assistance programs. Some cities, like some larger cities like New York City, for example, have affordable housing programs to supplement federal ones, but for the most part, it's just whatever the federal government's going to provide. So that's with the assistance. Fair housing laws, on the other hand, there are states that have, for example, California, a lot more protections available to tenants than are available at the federal level.
When there are landlords that are constantly breaching kind of like the mortgage and they're just terrible landlords, not kind of keeping their premises the way they should be, is there any recourse you can do other than like take them to the housing court? Can they lose their privilege of being a landlord?
It depends. So in federal subsidized housing programs, there's a couple where, for example, like I said, Section 8, project-based housing, and just Section 8 regular vouchers, where landlords have to comply with certain standards in order to get the status where they can take the federal funding. So if they're not complying with that, they can get kicked out of that program, which, you know, a lot of them wouldn't like, since it's an easy way for them to get tenants. On the other hand, there's a disincentive for tenants to report poor conditions in these kinds of projects, because if, you know, the landlord, you know, just doesn't comply, then they're out of a house. So kind of a mixed bag there.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the challenges faced by housing needs, whether that's adequately addressed.
So there is a big problem with rural, like, rental shortages in this country. I actually didn't work a whole lot on these issues this summer. I do know that a big problem is there's actually, so a lot of these programs were started like 20 or 30 years ago, and a big problem they're running into now is developers had to keep these developments subsidized for a certain period of time. And the time on these agreements is kind of coming up to an end in a lot of instances, and developers are deciding to make them free market rental apartments, which is, you know, exacerbating the shortage. Also, generally, rural development is not as on top of things as HUD in terms of complying with the federal statutes and promulgating rules on regulating their landlords and such. So there's a lot of issues with that.
Just in terms of Section 8 vouchers, is there, like, what's the incentive as a landlord to take on a tenant who's using the vouchers? I mean, other than the fact that you have if there's a lot of demand for how, like, you've got a sure tenancy essentially, but they're obviously taking a riskier tenant because effectively qualify for Section 8 because they're probably less likely to, financially they're less stable. So what is the incentive to take them? Because I know in New York, for example, I did housing law this summer in New York, and a lot of people, when they post, when they want to rent a place, they're not allowed to say that they won't take Section 8 tenants, but they often will not. So, like,
yeah,
what is that?
That's actually a huge problem. Like, right now, source of income is not a protection at a federal level, although a lot of states are trying to pass laws where landlords can't discriminate against people on the basis of, you know, the fact that they're using a housing voucher to supplement their rent. And honestly, I don't think landlords should be incentivized, because the whole point of a housing choice voucher is, yes, these people have some difficulties in terms of coming up with enough money to pay their rent, which is why they're in this program. And this program is going to assure that they do meet these rent obligations, right? And, in order to, better your economic situation, you have to have stable housing so you can have a regular job and, have your kids go to school. So it's kind of problematic, but it is an issue, particularly in hot markets where landlords are less willing. And one of the issues is also, quite frankly, that sometimes the subsidies offered by these programs, by Section 8 vouchers, are just not high enough to compete with what they could get on the